Eric is arguably the most complex character in the play. He appears to be an alcoholic, but we don't know why. He was drunk when he forced himself on Eva, but we don't know how far he forced himself and whether it was rape. He is with Eva for only a few months, and yet he has stolen £50, much more than she would need for an annual wage, or at least equal to an annual wage. Has he given all that money to her, or is he using it on himself? Eric appears to learn the lessons of the inspector, but if he's a hypocrite, then those lessons haven't been learnt, and we're left with these questions at the end of the play. One possible reason for his drinking is a reaction to the hypocrisy of his family. So, for example, here, when Sheila tells Gerald to be careful, after they've discussed his absence over the summer, Gerald says, "Oh, I will," and suddenly Eric guffaws, he bursts out laughing. This suggests really powerfully that he already knows about Gerald's affair, or if not Gerald's precise affair, that Gerald is sleeping around, and we don't know which of these two it is. Sheila asks to know what the joke is, and Eric defends the male. In other words, he feels he has to become part of the hypocrisy. He has to favour male power over female power. And so he just says he had to laugh. He can't explain to Sheila the cause of it. We can feel some of Eric's misery when he tells his father not to make any speech, but this is not too rude. However, his words to his sister, "We'll drink their health and have done with it," suggests a deep dissatisfaction with the marriage, as though he doesn't really approve of Gerald. And yet he himself has to have done with it, to put up with this marriage he doesn't approve of, with Gerald he doesn't approve of, for the sake of the family name. It also suits Priestley to give Eric this air of mystery, because he is at the centre of the whodunit to Eva Smith. His affair with Eva and the fact that she's having his child is going to be the final revelation that the inspector makes. And Priestley lays the ground for this early on. So when they're talking about a woman and her need for clothing as an extension of themselves, Eric says, "Yes, I remember," but then he checks himself. This suggests that perhaps at this stage he is not too drunk. But the next stage direction, Eric being confused, suggests that perhaps he is drunk. He doesn't know why he said what he's just said. The alternative is even more interesting, though. This confusion, if Eric is not drunk, is even more powerful. It's as though he's confused about his place in the family, and he doesn't actually know why he's lying. The problem, of course, is that Eva is from a different class to himself, and in this class-driven society, he can't admit to a relationship with somebody from a lower social class. Priestley drops another hint here when Eric says uneasily and sharply, "Here, what do you mean?" giving the audience another clue that there is a secret to be revealed. But if we look further, his annoyance is actually at the fact that it's Gerald who has said, "Unless Eric's been up to something." So Gerald could not know about Eric's stealing. However, he might well know about Eric's relationship with another woman. What's annoyed Eric here is he's just defended Gerald by not revealing to Sheila what he knows, but he thinks that Gerald has undermined him, and in private with Burling has shared his secret. This is even more interesting because what the two men have in common is the Palace Bar, and Gerald claims he hardly ever goes there. But the fact that Eric thinks Gerald might have betrayed him suggests that Gerald has been lying or will lie later in the play, and actually he similarly has been looking for female companionship, prostitutes if you like, at the Palace Bar. Another indication that Eric is not too drunk is his ability to step outside the action and comment on the play itself. So when the inspector arrives, Eric notes, and as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. So Eric makes the connection between the inspector's arrival and the very words and thoughts of his father that seem to have summoned him. So here he speaks with Priestley's point of view. Perhaps Priestley gives this point of view to such a flawed character to encourage those in his audience that they too could change their viewpoint. They don't have to be morally perfect to do so. They just have to be human beings. Eric's views are more socialist than capitalist, it seems. We see this here when Berling is talking about not raising the wages of Eva and her workforce. It isn't as if you can't go and work somewhere else, so they can't actually choose to work for another firm because that will probably be Crofts Limited and they will offer the same poor wages because the employers have, in effect, a monopoly. This could provide us with another reason why Eric has turned to drink. He is trapped in a family and in a business with which he disagrees, and he doesn't seem to have the moral courage, having got a degree at Oxbridge, to leave and set up in his own right. Rather than confront his father with a socialist viewpoint, he actually uses the logic of capitalism against him. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. This, if you like, is every person looking after their own interests and their own family, the very thing that Berling has been recommending. But as soon as someone else, Eva Smith and her colleagues, try, then the ringleaders are sacked. If capitalism is going to be moral, then it has to reward people for hard work. And here, you said yourself she was a good worker, therefore she should have been kept in post. However, capitalism isn't just about rewarding those who work hard, it's about exploiting those who are weaker. It's about the rich taking advantage of the poor, at least the way that Priestley presents it. That's the kind of capitalism he's attacking. When Eric starts to confess to his relationship with Eva, we start to see some interesting things happen to his choice of language. We first wonder whether he wishes to exploit Eva. She wasn't the usual sort, but, well, I suppose she didn't know what to do. It's her ignorance and perhaps her innocence that attracts him. If it's innocence, then we can feel some sympathy for Eric. He is attracted to someone who doesn't seem like a prostitute, who, if you like, can still be saved. But if we want to be more critical of him, he wants to take advantage of her. She didn't know what to do. She's the weak person in this relationship, and by definition, he does know what to do. There is also a lot of evidence that he's forced himself upon Eva. Yes, I insisted is a big clue that he's forced himself, and then the way he tries to distance himself from it, it seems. He's going to claim in a minute that he was possibly too drunk to remember, but this is also a way for him to distance himself from his guilt, and that also suggests he's really done something to feel guilty about. If he has raped her, he's behaved afterwards as though that hadn't happened. But afterwards she told me she didn't want me to go in. So there's clearly been an accusation that he has forced himself upon her. Again, this might not be rape. He's simply forced his way into her house, and she has agreed to have sex, perhaps. But let's look at his next bit of evidence. Well, I was in that state when not I could turn nasty, but a chap easily turns nasty. Again, he's using language to distance himself from what he's done. And this is a powerful clue that he's done something he really does feel guilty about and is trying to escape it in his own mind. And even when he's not talking about I, He's putting himself in the third person. He doesn't say a man because a man is powerful and threatening. He calls himself a chap in order to hide the fact that he was powerful and threatening. And there are two ways of looking at that threat. Here he says, and I threatened to make a row. So we might see this as a euphemism for him physically abusing her, that sort of row, a rape in which he's overpowering her physically. But there is a more subtle possibility which involves his class. So he would threaten to make a disturbance. And this does suggest that a landlady, for example, would be much more likely to take his side because he is upper class and worth money. So a close reading of the play is still ambiguous. We don't know if he's merely forced himself into the room and Eve has eventually agreed to have sex with him, or whether he's forced himself upon her sexually and actually we're looking at a rape. However, my preference is to look at the language he uses once he's describing it, and again he distances himself. That's when it happened. He can't name it, and that again suggests to me that he's probably thinking that he has raped her. Of course, if he's being honest here, he might well have been too drunk to remember what he has in fact done, and his biggest fear might be that he's raped her, but he doesn't want to find out if this is true. So he points out, I didn't even remember, that's the hellish thing. He is in his own private version of hell because he fears how guilty he should be. His drinking, of course, might be brought on by the fact that he doesn't want to face what he's done. And here's another clue. How stupid it all is, not how stupid I've been. Again, he's desperately trying to distance himself from what he's done, which suggests he's done something worth forgetting about. And so, in my reading, I feel he probably has raped her. You can, of course, disagree. We can see just how drunk Eric must have been by the fact that he couldn't remember her name or even where she'd lived. He must have made his way home from there, but obviously hadn't sobered up enough to remember where it was. And then again, he uses this language of distance. Instead of, but I saw her again in the Palace Bar, I happened to see her. In other words, this has become a habit for Eric to seek out women to have sex with at the bar, and it just happens that he saw Eva there. The next time he meets her, he's still drunk, but I wasn't so bad. In other words, he's not forced himself upon her the second time. But what kind of person has he been? Well, this time we talked a bit. This is hardly romantic. What they've talked about is very brief. He's just told her his name and what job he does. In other words, he's pretty much got down to sex with her straight away. Now, from Eva's point of view, at the very best, she's having sex with someone who's been abusive towards her and forced himself into her flat. He's had sex with her and presumably not left any money. He doesn't mention that at all. So she's got nothing out of this if it's the very best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, she's talking to a man who doesn't really remember who she is very well and has raped her. In both cases, what would reduce her to associating with this person again? It can only be her extreme poverty. Priestley's suggesting here that women have no other option but to put up with the abuse of men. We could see Eric as a kind of feminist creation, a construct who is an average man to show what the average man is capable of, completely exploiting those less powerful than themselves, and in this society, that's women. And again, we can focus on his sense of denial. She was pretty and a good sport. And a good sport here is a euphemism for she was willing to have sex with me. Again, there is no mention of money here, and perhaps Eva is surviving simply by finding men she can have brief relationships with. This would suggest to to us, that there is a distinction in Eva's mind between prostitution and pretending, at least to herself, that she's having sex with men because she finds them attractive. In a purely capitalist relationship, of course, Eric would pay her to have sex. But Priestley is suggesting that people's emotions, not just towards each other, but towards themselves, are more complicated than that. Perhaps because Eric has been so critical of himself and denying what he's actually done, he now turns on Burling. I hate these fat old tarts around the town. Here we can see the attraction to Eva. She's young and perhaps not yet a tart. There isn't that financial pay that he's paying her as a prostitute. However, he's attacking Burling and his friends for having sex with these prostitutes, these tarts. It's the hypocrisy that angers him, and again that suggests that he also views himself as a hypocrite, and so his anger at himself he is displacing and using that to attack Burling and the other influential men in the town. There is a suggestion that Eric is naive as well. He denies things to himself, and this is apparent here. Eva treated me as if I were a kid, and this is a heavy clue from Priestley that Eric is still relatively childish. And the evidence for this is here. Well, she hadn't a job and didn't feel like trying again for one, and she'd no money left. In other words, Eva here has made it very clear that their sexual relationship is a financial one. She doesn't actually want to ask for money for each time they have sex, but she does want a relationship where the man she's having sex with provides for her. This, if you like, is like her relationship with Gerald, although of course she was probably in love with Gerald and is not in love with Eric. Logically, of course, she would expect Eric to have quite a lot of money because he's told her his name. She knows he's the son of Burling, who owns the factory she used to work in. The other thing Eric hasn't realised is quite how much money he's given her. This £50 is a significant amount of money. It's much more than the weekly wage she was getting while working for Burling. So one possibility here is Priestley makes Eric steal so much money because he wants the stealing to be seen as a real crime, one that he could be prosecuted for. Again, his childishness is highlighted. "You mean you stole the money?" said the inspector. "No, not really," replies Eric. Well, of course he has stolen the money, and he can't really pay it back. But once more, he's in denial. And Priestley could do this for two reasons. The first might be that the inspector teaches Eric a lesson, so that when the inspector's gone, we see Eric now behaving as an adult. He has learnt the inspector's lesson. However, another possibility is that Eric will only appear to learn the inspector's lesson because beneath it he's actually very childish. In fact, we might argue that that is the whole point of the cliff-hanging ending of the play. Priestley allows us to imagine what Eric might be like in the future. He doesn't tell us which way Eric is going to decide, whether he should inherit his father's business and be a ruthless capitalist as Gerald is, or whether he should be more enlightened and give fair wages to every one of his employees. We simply don't know what kind of man Eric is going to become, but we certainly have a lot of doubts. He does seem to be full of hatred for his parents, certainly his mother, for killing his grandchild and his partner. Damn you, he emphasises, as though actually condemning her to hell. Then the stage direction, he is almost threatening her, again perhaps suggesting how violent he might be towards women, or just suggesting how much he hates his mother. You don't understand anything, you never did, you never even tried. So on the one hand, Eric here could be presented to us as somebody who is completely different from his parents and will make a better world, a socialist one. On the other hand, we might look at this as a typically youthful outburst. It's almost a parody of the kind of conversation and argument that a teenager might have with their parents. And I think Priestley wants this ambiguity to stay there, to make us think hard about what the future might hold. Curiously, it's Sheila who stops him carrying on. Eric, don't. So we don't know how far he would have gone here, but Sheila has a sense of it. If she is preventing Eric from speaking his mind, perhaps this is a signal from Priestley that the inspector's lessons won't be fully learned. After the action of the play, Sheila and Eric will revert to being more typically like members of their own class. Priestley does allow us to take an optimistic view of Eric. When Mrs. Burling says she's ashamed of him, he replies, "Well, I don't blame you." He is now ashamed of himself, and perhaps the earlier language when he distanced himself from what he'd done is revealing his own sense of shame, and if he feels shame, he'll probably change. And now he speaks as an adult. But don't forget, I'm ashamed of you as well. Yes, both of you. And this is the kind of way a parent might talk to a child. So Eric has turned the tables on his parents, not in an hysterical way here, but in a reasoned way. So we could look at the transformation in Eric that the inspector produces as an optimistic one that is going to last. And a socialist future, by definition, is possible, even from the rich. As if to reinforce that, Priestley gives Eric his own views. Again, he is the proxy, the spokesperson for Priestley. You told us that a man has to make his own way, look after himself and mind his own business. And this, you'll remember, is exactly the moment that the inspector appears. As if we were all mixed up together, is in fact the inspector's message. I didn't notice you told him that it's every man for himself. And this repetition of the idea that every man must look after himself is ridiculed by Eric on Priestley's behalf. So one way of reading this is to see Eric as a cause of optimism. If he can change, even such a flawed character as he is, then we all can. But Priestley doesn't leave it there. Again, he offers us this ambiguity. So Eric here is shouting, and then just a moment later, quietly and bitterly, we see that he's not entirely rational or controlled, and he swings from one thing to another. We don't, in this way, fully trust Eric's conversion. And I say the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her, and that's what matters. So that is the message of the inspector, which we want Eric to accept. However, the fact that he is shouting it like this suggests that he's merely voicing his anger at his family. It might not be anger about what he's done to Eva. In other words, he might overcome this feeling later. Now he becomes quiet. I don't give a damn whether I stay or not. This is something we should be optimistic about. If he makes his own way in the world, then he'll be able to make his own decisions, not being dependent on his parents' money. An optimistic view would look at the fact that Eric doesn't just look at his own actions, doesn't alter the fact that we all helped to kill her. In other words, he's seeing the society that he's part of, and certainly the family that he's part of, as the problem in destroying the life of this young woman. However, looked at from an alternative perspective, he is no longer focusing on the fact that he is stolen money, that he's probably raped her. He's looking at how they are all complicit. But this could be, for Eric, a way of deflecting the blame from himself, as we've seen him do so many times before. And if he's deflecting the blame from himself, then perhaps he is less likely to change in the future. So there you have it, a very complex character, I think the most complex in the play, and more complex because he seems to put forward so many of Priestley's views. When you're writing about Eric, it's important for you to decide which of these two views best suit your interpretation of the play. But writing about the conflict between the two is always going to be an A-star section of your essay. Good luck.